sort of open questions for myself as well. Oh, thanks for recording as always for our little online archive that hopefully will exist at the end of this whole project. Yeah, so a couple of questions that that came to me from reading it and how it could work for the kind of work we do in terms of migration studies and how it could be applied and so on. And yeah, maybe I think Keith, you weren't here last time. I think the reason why we kind of, well, why I chose, or we kind of had a discussion, Mila and me afterwards, how we want to kind of proceed. And it was that the last article was about the border region between Italy and France, and it had a lot to do with the physicality of the place. And that's something that emerged from the discussion was the sort of more than human approach. That has become quite popularized in human geography over the last months and years. Yep. And yeah, so I kind of came across this article and I thought it would be kind of connecting to that, so we can discuss maybe this idea of the more than human, but also to home as a kind of slightly new concept we haven't really explored yet, and that is obviously quite central to migration studies and discourses of migration, discourses of the nation state, metaphors of home, metaphors of the nation state as a home, and so on. Not so much in this article, but I'm thinking of where could we take those concepts. So yeah, maybe just very quickly, I thought, and then I'd be very happy to hear what people thought about it and what ideas you guys had. For me, I mean, there's a lot, so I'm trying to like remember what the kind of main points were that I found interesting. There were several where I kind of got further and where I thought would be interesting to hear what you guys thought. So kind of one in like deeper into the article was this idea that, let's see, it was in 1135, this idea that yeah, how it helps. So it was, you know, they had the categorization in different imaginaries, and one of them was economic, and this idea that non-human elements, this idea specifically the relation to animals and so on, was something that marginalized, so in this case rural migrants moving into the city used actually to what they called negotiate their right to habitable spaces in the city. So there was almost a choice to say this is we don't want to live in the slum, but on those urban fringes because of those elements. And yeah, there was a kind of, I don't know, sort of initially this, you know, famous concept of the right to the city popped into my head, and how, but that also related to something, I think that was very early in the article. Again, what I would quite like to discuss is this idea of agency, but not sort of, not as intentionality. So moving away from the human, but agency as a kind of set of relations between the human and non-human. And so that it's the right of the city, this right to the city, because of that non-human element. So maybe not how we usually imagine that. So I found that quite interesting. And I think then a very, very big one, which I thought, but again, this is very open in my head, I'm not fully sure yet how to conceptualize it, was that this kind of more than human imaginaries also quite unsettle the image of the home as a confined territory. So very much at the heart of the kind of theories, at least how I read it, was that it's yeah, that this idea of seeing home as a, I don't know how to put it, maybe a set of relations, or as a relational, as more of a practice almost than a bounded object. And I guess there's a lot to explore how that can be used in migration studies, in all the kind of research we do to maybe, you know, challenge very dominant conceptions of the home as this bounded territory, because obviously seeing home as this bounded thing comes with a range of assumptions that are quite at the heart of, you know, like all sorts of asylum politics and so on, of who's allowed in, who's a guest, who's a host, and so on and so on. And yeah, something I thought of was quite interesting as well, maybe someone who's a little bit more experienced with, I know Alet is quite interesting in that, was the kind of discussion of methodologies. So it's just like, you know, with photo elicitation they had there, and the way of approaching that is like almost like, yeah, how do you start, you know, the whole idea of a more than human approach, because the thing is you're still a human researcher, so it's almost a bit of a contradiction. How do you do more than human research as a human kind of bound to these limitations of, you know, seeing and interpreting and so on and so on. So would be quite interested to hear what people have to say about that. And yeah, so yeah, that's maybe a good start. I don't want to talk too long and to kind of take it too much in my hands, but I've got like a couple of more things here. But let's maybe start with that, this idea of formal methodology. So, or maybe any other concepts that people have kind of, you know, found interesting in reading that. Does anyone want to start? Anyone has anything that is burning on their heart and that they want to get out? Alet, let's start off with you.
Yeah, I really liked the structure of the article, and there was a line on page 1140, basically in the conclusion. It says that while the Western home's tendency towards increasing separation from nature demands research, the deeply ingrained human nature entanglements of some Western homes provide an alternative lens to understand more than human worlds. And I think what that's saying is kind of sometimes we try to forget that actually, you know, we can't control everything. It's like my house is like the damp comes in a lot in winter and it's just really annoying. But the truth is that's just, you know, that is nature finding its way back into this human construct thing. And I really like the way that the paper just helped to I like the idea of the imaginaries and the way that nature and the economics side of things all found its way into this piece of land that people lived in and worked in. I just thought, you know, it's really good. I really liked it. It's really, really well written, and I like that idea of accepting that it's not everything's controlled by humans.
I'd like to get back in a couple of minutes to that, because I thought there's something really interesting there for kind of the work we do. But let's see what others have to hear maybe first. Keith?
When I saw this paper this morning, I read it this morning, I thought, you must have chosen that especially for me, because it's like this is exactly the sort of work that I love. And it's sort of, it really is the sort of thing, the more than human stuff is something I'm really into at the moment. And I think it's really, and they say they've written it really well. I mean, there's some criticisms I've got of it, things it hasn't covered and stuff, but generally speaking, I think it presents the whole sort of more than human very clearly. It's very well written. And I think they've sort of analysed it, and they've really made the case that, you know, the home is not just about either a legal thing, legal sort of representational thing, or just a physical defined space, but as very much as Aled was suggesting there, it's much more than that, and it sort of extends outside, but it also takes in very personal, very sort of emotional connections that are often, say, not to other people, though they could be. That's one of the areas I didn't analyse, which is quite interesting. But they just could be to the more than human aspects of it. And I thought, you know, I think it summarises things very nicely. It draws along a lot of people that I'm really into, and I really enjoyed it. So that was a really good paper. But as I say, I have got some sort of criticisms of it, but we perhaps get to those a bit later on.
Can do, yeah, if we want to get back to that, sort of maybe shortcomings a bit. I had like one or two, but
if you want to, some of the things I think, it's sort of, because it tries to make the case, and I think it does so very well, that the groups of people, these refugees, are sort of, they can't buy into sort of conventional housing. And I think it'd be nice to see how maybe a group of sort of quote conventional working class, say settlers, you know, who weren't refugees, etc., how they sort of judge their home themselves. So you can get a direct sort of comparison, because it's like a lot of these sorts of case studies that are done in this tradition. They're very much in and of themselves, and that's lovely. That's really interesting. But I've always got, because I come from originally a scientific background, I always think, well, how do they compare to the other groups? How do they all the time? How do they compare? So I thought that sort of, maybe that sort of lack of benchmarking in that sense. I mean, they made the case that more conventional households might need to sort of emphasize the legal side of things more, but we didn't get much really evidence of that. And similarly, I also noticed they want to draw out the more than human. I'm very much in favor of that, but they could have also perhaps researched how the sort of interhuman, the sort of community relations that are there in those communities more, and foregrounded that a little bit more. Another final thing that they sort of didn't really cover, which the word mentioned later on, is that they don't look at the concept of liminality and the liminal as much as I might have done. It's a big topic in my sort of second year module that I teach. So it comes up that space is uncertain. It almost defines it right at the start there, but they don't mention that concept until it is mentioned. The word does come up later on, but it's just mentioned in passing. And I thought maybe they could draw upon that literature a bit more, those sorts of spaces that are not defined by one thing or another, but are both of them or neither of them. And how do you get sort of connected to that in a way that you do for more sort of established spaces? Oh, and the final thing I thought I didn't note, when they get to their table and everything, the spirit of my hero, Henri Lefebvre, is there all the time about his 3 ideas of spatiality. Not mentioned at all, but it could have been cited there because it resembles some of the stuff I write about rural and sort of 3 types of sort of spatiality there, which I've adapted from Lefebvre. So I think, it taps into all sorts of things. It sort of talks about a lot of them, Ingold and people like that, and that's one of my heroes, but it doesn't sort of cover as many as it could do, perhaps. But that's probably pushing it a bit, because there's only so much they can cover in an article, but there we go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, I think they struck a relatively good balance. I personally found that there is a lot in there, but it doesn't overwhelm you as the reader. And as someone who is not really read in the more than human approach, I found it kind of, I could follow it. But I agree with you. And just to quickly go in there before we maybe move on, something I found a little bit as well was the kind of, there's 2 elements you said of how the community aspect is maybe a bit outed. So it's very much about the more than human in terms of plants, animals, its surroundings, which is super interesting. But it also makes quite clear that it's a particular context of rural migrants and who kind of rely on that for economic reasons and so on. And I thought to myself, I was like, what are potential shortcomings here? And sort of 2 that for me came to mind. It was like, exactly, how does it compare? Why? So if we limit it to these, like, to this, let's say plants, animals, and so on, then yes, we confine it as well to this particular distinct group of migrants on the urban fringes. And that doesn't tell us much, for example, for what kind of more than human exists in the slums, where they are clearly not going. But then also I was like, okay, maybe there is a kind of, I don't really think, I think there's not a lot of danger there, but conceptually speaking, it's a bit like, almost I don't know how to call it, like there's a bit of a danger of is it conceptually helpful to be that focused on a non-Western context? So I'm absolutely for breaking down the kind of colonial elements in Western academy and going these voices, but I was like, okay, maybe there's almost like a danger hypothetically might be a bit of a glorification of this, like look how there's a closer relation to nature here that doesn't exist in the kind of
Orientalism,
Western modern context sort of thing. So, but this was just me almost making up, like, what could I criticize about it? But it was a bit similar sort of thing that I thought, okay, maybe this is I find like, yeah, so this was very very focused on rural migrants, and it was a very distinct case study, and I was like, because I thought conceptually there was so much interesting stuff there about home and how we could really rethink the home. But if we kind of keep it conceptually so narrow to that, like, non-Western context and the specifically rural, rural migrants on urban fringes, might it kind of lose a little bit of its analytical power if we keep it so separated and contextual. But thank you. That was definitely helping me kind of thinking through that. What did other people thought there? What is kind of the themes you found interesting? What did trigger you on the paper? Miriam?
Yeah, I can follow up on that. It definitely bring back Henri Lefebvre approach as production of space to me as well. And what I found really interesting was it was as if, like, with all these imaginaries, they was kind of able to put I'm not sure, like, the right translation of Lefebvre concept in French, in English, but I think you will follow up. But like the space of representation that was coming into place as perceived space, like as spaces that are lived by people in their daily lives. And what strikes me is that it seems that it was possible because it was the state wasn't taking interest on these spaces, like as if, like, if you try to do that in a more controlled space, like, you will not be able to put your own representations, like be there aesthetic, economics, or diverse economy. They were talking about this Gibson it was interesting too. And yeah, I feel it was really striking how that absence of the state was making it possible for that thinking of Lefebvre to just happen.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much it for me, I guess. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is really interesting conceptually. I haven't thought that far, but that it emerges that way. For me, that was something more in the article, like I think as briefly a sentence where they're talking about the context of how these urban fringes are actually like these kind of land banks that people buy up, and there's like a lot of value in them, but they're kind of letting them live there. And I was like, this is really interesting. I was like, a bit more context. Are people there as well? Is there sort of a process of displacement? Like, so now we have these rural migrants living there. So if suddenly the rich Bangladeshis want their land back, what happens there? Is there any process like this going on? But absolutely, you're quite right there. So
I mean, that's reinforces their liminal status, those spaces, because they're not one thing or the other. They're not sort of developed, they're not housing, but they're not open. So they have this uncertainty. So the people, the challenge is for these people to create this sense of homeness or homeliness about these spaces, but it's very, they're going to be. If I think they said there's some urban fringe or fringe development area of luxury fringe or something like that. There's a term there I thought was quite good. So I mean, in other words, the reality is probably in a year's two's time that some of these they'll be just evicted and they'll demolish their houses and they'll be moved away. So they've got to try and find something in that time to sort of create the sense of place and sense of homeliness in their sort of spaces, because they have very little power otherwise.
I agree with that. I think also it's kind of they're bringing their habitus, their way of being from a different geography to this new geography, and this is a space between different geographies which may or may not survive. And I really also liked the diagram in there with the space and how everything had been drawn onto that plan. I thought that was really clever, and it helped to kind of see these three different spheres of kind of influence as well. But yeah, the spiritual, aesthetic, and economic. I think it's probably, like you're saying, Franz, it's very particular to this particular example. But I think we could go back in time and we could also see how lots of different places have people have come from the countryside to live in the town, and they've carried on with their previous practice and lived like that for a certain time. That's, you can definitely see that in 19th century Britain and France for sure. So it's kind of a similar concept but updated.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe that concept could be I don't know. I'm trying to think of these more liminal spaces. How it's is that something that as a conceptual framework? I mean, nowadays they get shorter and shorter because in Europe the state has an interest of destroying these camps. But let's say in Calais, the refugee camp, that you had the jungle and so on. I mean, there's people who literally lived there for years. Sort of what kind of borderline homely spaces emerged there that are now gone and not mapped, and because they are they've been destroyed and are gone. And what kind of how do you capture those experiences perhaps?
Can I say
I
don't want to kind of take over, but I think I was reading this paper thinking what kind of questions does it pose? And for me, the first question which I have, because it's about, we're kind of reading it in the context of migration reading group, I was trying to ask a question, perhaps something which we can all think about if you want to, is what is different about home in relation to migration? So what happens here? Why it becomes a different thing? So looking at the experiences of homing or homelessness of migrants, and I tend to think about it as I was really keen to see more in the paper about what makes home in migration different. Even when that Jamie, one of your colleagues who has written the master station on home, is not here. So Jamie Abramson, because she was kind of really writing about it in terms of experiences of home by Asian migrants in Swansea. And it's kind of really, Keith, you were there, Keith. And it's sort of really questioning, what makes home different when it's become kind of mobilized? What exactly makes home different? So that's a question, first question, which I was really trying to answer to myself in a question in this paper, and I'm not sure I got an answer. And the second thing, to me, kind of, I was thinking, what are the three key contributions this paper makes in relation to the definition of home? So I was trying to think about what does it do? So to me, these three definitions are sort of three contributions are first, it's about something, so it kind of tries to imagine home as something which is not owned, so something which we don't necessarily have mastery of, that sense of control, a sense of shaping, and I think Alex kind of referral to draft and stuff like that, despite carefully arranged pictures, is a sense of an ability to control, to master things. And I think that's really comes through the paper. But I don't think it really is clear in terms of what they're trying to say. So that's kind of first thing which I learned from it. Second thing, which I thought was really useful, again, maybe not as pronounced, is I was thinking about the paper talking about home as not being delineated. So it's not something which is clearly circumscribed. We're so used to thinking about home as a plan or as a kind of as an object which can be located on a map, which has some certain clear presence or absence of, And here, really, I think it's something which can really relate to migration, where lots of people deal with different homes, where sort of they connect to homes they left behind, maybe their parents' home. That would be really interesting to see in this paper, but I don't think it really comes through. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just didn't see it. But it does speak about this home as being kind of this porous kind of home, being outdoors, indoors, kind of interacting with the elements within it. So to me, that there is the potential here, and I think it's a really interesting point. Well, at least I kind of took it as an interesting point. And the third thing, which I thought was really interesting here, is that it's really interesting. It talks about home not being necessarily human, and what in my terms, what it poses a question about then how and why can we bring it into human knowledge. So if it is something which is kind of co-produced, co-constructed, with the non-human actors and so on, so how can we then meaningfully talk about it as home using the terms which are so overwhelmingly human dominated? I'm not saying we should kind of go and let the plants describe a home or cow. Again, it can be an interesting experiment, but I don't think it will be really useful. But looking at the structure of the paper, it's all, spiritual, economic, aesthetic. These are clearly the terms which reflect
human,
human knowledge. And I think, how can we make it more sympathetic in terms of descriptions? How can we think about? And I'm thinking about things like, the easiest way for me to answer this question is to think about some of the reflections which the authors have about, home as being hopeful. So they're talking about migrants who came, and for them there's this hope. Hope is not something which one has. It's not necessarily owned. It's not necessarily human. It is an affect. It's something which exists beyond particular persons, right? Or home has been fearful place, whatever it is. So fear, again, is not something which we have. Although it's kind of in French, it's very classic. It's j'ai peur, I have fear, is it right? In English, I fear. So it's kind of, it doesn't have the sense of ownership. Fear is an external thing. It's not something which I have. Sorry, guys. It's kind of I like this play on words in French and English in that sense. And so I wonder, what is the way for us to kind of think about those non-human elements in describing homes and giving them more space in categorizing them, if you want, or talking about homes, which can be more sympathetic to these kind of things, haunted homes, where sort of ghostly presences of things exist, or whatever, things which are really clearly beyond human and impossible to put into words. If you talk about, haunted things, people like, Tim Edensor wrote a lot about it. So, I really thought in my kind of, I was looking, this is what I took from it, but I was really looking for clear descriptions and really the thing about mobility and home, I would have liked to see more of, but it's kind of my thought. Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe I can jump in there very quickly and then see what other people thought of it, because we have now, I think, 3 cool ways we can go ahead with that discussion. To number one, and what I got, I absolutely on your first point, as this home as not owned. So first of all, with the criticism, I agreed to that. I was like, strangely enough, I found the concept of the migrant a bit missing from that paper. It is there in the title, but in the actual sort of story that unfolds, there's very little of what makes the migrant experience different, and for the experience of home as well. There's kind of hints in that, but it's never quite clearly spelled out. I was like, okay, is it their marginalization? Is it their rural background? Is it the urban fringe that determines the home as more porous and less owned? But it's all, yeah, you kind of, it gives the reader a lot of ways of reading into it. It doesn't really clearly spell it out for you of, you know, that's what you should take from it. So I completely agree with that. But on the first one, I think there's actually a lot of potentiality out. This idea definitely has a lot of promise. The home is not owned. And it relates to what Alet said earlier about this idea of, you know, that somehow your home is, you know, like giving up this idea of the home as a space of mastery, as you called it, or I think Alet used the word control. We have kind of obviously relations here between those. But I think this is actually conceptually and politically speaking really important for us at this migration studies, because if you think about why, you know, we have sort of these strong hegemonic discourses around asylum based on fear and distrust and so on, it's about the outside as dangerous. The home as mastery, something that can from the outside is threatening, right? So it threatens your mastery over the space, but it also, it goes against the conception of the home as this confined space. So maybe starting to think of the home as something that's from the beginning not owned, and actually kind of trying to rethink what makes it homely is a relation with the outside, could kind of be a first conceptual step to rethinking, you know, I mean, we as scholars, I think that there's like, I know very little people see that, but in politics, you know, it's very dominant. Migration is framed as a problem, as something that needs to be managed, controlled, that is therefore something that needs to be controlled, has some sort of inherent danger to it, right? Like that is usually how it is talked about. So, and I think there's a lot of relation to that conception of the home there. So maybe that's a kind of way of thinking about the home as not owned. I think this is a really, really interesting way of kind of going on about it. But yeah, I don't want to kind of capture that conversation too much. On what Sergey said, do other people want to jump in there? Maybe on the like the idea of home as not delineated or porous. I thought that's quite interesting as well. Or the third one even more interesting, like the home as not human. How do we even start imagining that? So anyone has
Yeah, I think it's about time. It's about our current place in time. And if you look back 100, 150 years, then most homes would have had more of an intersection with nature and with animals and definitely with spirituality as well. And, you know, if you read D.H. Lawrence, he writes about the end of the 19th century and the start of 20th century, and so there was a period in our histories when we became, you know, urban dwellers and people who lived in the town and the city more than people who lived in the countryside. So I would argue that actually this whole piece just takes us back to something which happened in industrial societies a long time ago. So it's just, that's my view anyway, that it's something that we've forgotten has happened already in Britain and France and America and countries like that.
Yeah, just to support really what Alad's saying there in a way, this article was a reminder that the home maybe isn't this fixed box in a tower block, shall we say, that often the sort of dominant urban discourses suggest. And I think that has severe implications, not just for residents like these people in the global south, but internationally, with a sort of model of the compact city, for example, being promoted as a very sort of dense city as the sort of way forward for sustainability. Whereas what we've seen, of course, with things like COVID is that people want a bit of space, they want a bit of nature, they want something else. that's very much coming through, I think, in the case studies in this article here. So it really sort of reinforces the need to have a much more flexible, much more open sense of what the home is all about. And I think it's, that, so in other words, it may be a case study set in which country it was now, in India, but it was actually, it has much more sort of broader, I think, implications and importance there, and obviously very important there as well, but
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that's why it's a good paper. It's it kind of has more potential of spelling out these actually quite groundbreaking, but it kind of, I thought that's again like something I was like, it could really make more sort of, bigger theoretical claims beyond its narrow, case study format. I don't know. But I think
we can do that with it. They don't have to do it all themselves. That's the point. I would use something like that to make another point, to sort of use it as sort of evidence and support. So I don't think they need to try and cram it all into one paper, because it'd just be too dense to read then, and I think, oh no, it's too much. But one thing I'd noted, you're talking about conventional ideas of the home, are sort of suggesting they're very sort of safe, sort of delineated spaces. But of course, again, that's a very often a very gender specific perspective on the home. And one thing I thought the paper could have done more of was draw out sort of gender differences in these attitudes of home between the people, residents of this site, because that's something it's mentioned a bit later on, but it's not really developed. But I think one interesting question would be to see to what extent the men, because the women talk about the men who go away to work, and they have sort of very set, defined sort of economic lives and things, and they get quite upset and emotional about it. So I think that angle would have been interesting to see a bit more about, which probably maybe in other papers they've done that. So I don't know. They're not. I think I recognise one of the names on the article, but I don't know the lead author. It's really interesting, I think. So
I'll put it on a note that I wrote with a colleague historian last year on this kind of spiritual homes, with sort of talking about different meanings of home there, and kind of extending this discussion. I think I'm going there quite far in terms of the sense of presenting home as something as a dispossession rather than a possession. So going kind of beyond that sense of mastery. But I'm not gonna, it's not relevant. We're discussing a different paper here. What I was thinking might be useful is to think about home in migration through the ideas of Heidegger. So he's a German philosopher who talks about different kind of experiences of homing, and I think it's Heimlet. Whoever speaks German. Oh, sorry, Franz.
I do
was looking around thinking, this is so.
Do you speak German, Franz?
Swansea kind of thing, and somehow, Franz, you were Danish for me, kind of, because of your affiliation. And so I have to be careful how
I only identify pictures. I cannot actually read German, in fact. But no, yeah.
Exactly. So correct my German. So Heidegger talks about this kind of Heimlet, and and this kind of. So for him, what I was really interested in when I was kind of writing about home is that sense of homing and a kind of the experience of unhomely. So when people effectively understand what is important for them, what is meaningful to them, by going through the experiences of unhomely, of going somewhere else. It doesn't necessarily need to be a different physical space, but something else. And that's and that creates that sense of home, because you can, by doing something different. Hello. You kind of you learn about yourself. You learn about what home means to you. So he was talking about this unheimlich, experience of going through this. Oh, again, Franz, correct me.
No, that's quite right. Yeah.
So that to me, that was really interesting about this experience of migration, when suddenly you kind of experience a sense of unhomeliness, and unhomely is always something which is beyond your expectation, beyond your human mastery. Experiences which are described here as non-human, that have really been played up and explained in these terms. This is what migration does. We all moved one way or another through our kind of lifetime. We all kind of went through this experience of unhomely, of learning about what kind of matters, and perhaps never arriving at home, because we're continuously kind of learning about what home is supposed to mean for us. So that was kind of really something which I thought kind of useful to think in the context of migration, if you wanted to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I thought that absolutely. I think there's two things here with in terms of the emotions of home, the feelings of home, and you mentioned Heidegger, and there's an interesting wordplay on the Unheimlich. It resonates first of all with the unhomely, but also from the sound of it, I think it is a bit of a wordplay with the kind of uncanny. So it sounds very similar. So there's the element of something that is goes beyond the kind of perceptible. There's some sort of uneasiness about not being home. Absolutely. And it kind of goes back to the article what we said. It's just like what makes the migrants' experience of home perhaps different. And maybe that's a new topic we can go into. I don't know if someone else wants to jump onto it, but definitely this idea of feelings of home, belonging, was a little bit missing, I thought, because I thought that was quite. It's mentioned, I think, in page 126, so that ideals or imaginaries of home are permeated with feelings of home, but it kind of leaves it there. And I was like, okay, what are feelings of home? Is that belonging and non-belonging, or what exactly? And I thought this is actually really, really interesting, because maybe kind of to think about home differently. Again, I'm constantly, just through my own work, trying to get it back to migration studies, and I'm interested in the nation state, discourses of the nation state, why we talk about it in terms of home, and that a very problematic element of modern asylum policies is that it's a threatened home. That's how it's conceptualized. Something that needs, and that it's constantly talked about in the terms of that it needs to be safe, right? Like, so, but how Keith pointed out, there's very, this is a very gendered, first of all. Generally, the home is safe for man, for women not as much, traditionally speaking. And also, this might be interesting of like, I thought of potential projects, and it was like how, research projects is how people with a, who are non-white or have a migration background feel about the nation state as a home, right? If you're not feeling as safe around, let's say, the police or representatives of the state, do you think about the nation state in the same sense as a home? So maybe going away with this home, is the home this like, does it necessarily need to be safe? But then I stopped talking. But as a last kind of very subjective personal experience, it's kind of funny that I always like, when I go back, right, like I never had this thing that's like, I don't know, this maybe just through my upbringing, that I sort of, like how a lot of people do. And, specifically in Saxony, where I'm from in East Germany, the AfD is very strong. As a strong resonance is the story of home as safe, and everything that comes from the outside is dangerous, and we need to protect ourselves. And I never had that, but what I could resonate with was this kind of feelings of home, of belonging. Like, I have this like love-hate relationship with the place where I'm from, but every time I go back, it's like the accent. It's such a horrible accent, but like when I hear that, I was like, those are my people. Like, this is you feel home. You can't just describe it. It's just like it's a form of belonging. Of there is definitely an affectual element to it, far more for me. This is just a very personal experience, but far more than this idea of safety. I mean, I feel probably less safe there than at other places, but generally speaking, I feel quite safe everywhere. It's a privilege thing. So so maybe a little bit kind of to sum that up, this idea of like feelings of home, like, so what does it mean as well to be at home? I think Sergey has, I don't know, by accident or choice, left us. I would think
his battery's run out, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
a message about his battery.
I don't know. I think you can criticize it too much. I think it's a well-constructed piece. I thought the diagram was really good. I think the idea of the imaginaries is great. I personally, I think that's enough. I think, there's plenty of other things which consider home. And I think this is just kind of one case study of how people have made a new home, but using existing ideas in a different place.
Felix?
Yeah, about this question of the feeling of belonging, I found that like the study is focused about migrants in urban spaces or urban fringes, but they don't speak about how those people think about the city and how they replace themselves in front of urban spaces. Because like I wish I could have seen in this article more like representations of the city and urban population or home in the city, and how it can like explain some practices like in going to live in urban fringes to find others another environment, and then how like the experience of the migration and the experience of like arriving in the city like could also influence this feeling of belonging.
Yeah.
I wouldn't surprise me at all if those sort of topics were not the subject of another paper they've written. So these days we're encouraged to produce all these different papers and cut the whole thing up to little pieces, which is something. Yeah, don't start us on that one. But no, it's. I mean, as I say, like Aled, I think it was a really good paper, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's a really good piece of work. So I will cite that one sometime. It's something I write. So. And I'm unlikely to be writing about populations in India, but the general points from it, I think, are very valid. Yeah.
No, I thought absolutely so too. Because I think I meant it as a compliment that it leaves things open. It makes you think in different directions. I think papers that are too keen on making their argument and convincing the reader about it, it kind of gives you Scheuenklappen, as we say in German, like what you have on horses, so you can only look at a certain direction.
Blinkers. Blinkers.
Yeah, blinkers. Yeah. So I actually quite liked that. It gave me like pages and pages of notes of like, you could just think about it this way and this way. And Mila.
Yeah, I would like to react about what we were saying and the feeling of home, and like everything was really interesting, and this text also really relate to my work. And about this feeling is just like I was thinking that it really relates to my work in the way that I explore this idea of home without trying to explore it when I'm working with my respondents. What I mean is like to come back to what also Miriam said about the production of space. Basically, I'm working on the production of Europe through a socio-constructivist approach. So knowing how Europe is constructed by representation of migrants. And one part of the migrants I'm working on, so it's like European migrants, they would basically define Europe, so like international macro-regional space, by talking about home. So they would say Europe is where I feel home. So they will include as also what's in France, like kind of like national states idea of like to include in their definition, because it was like I feel home in Romania, for example, because I speak the language, and in this place because blah blah blah. But they would talk about like more like it won't be really precise place, but more like broader general space. And so I was saying that because they were really describing it as a feeling without basically knowing how to define it a lot, but they will basically refer to their practice of mobility. So as migrants, where they have lived, sometimes they lived in several countries in Europe, Germany, Copenhagen, UK, I don't know. It's just like, so they will, relate to their practice of mobility, but also their social relation. And this kind of thing, yeah. So this is something really that really, I think, relate for one type of migration I'm working on in a way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm trying to, I really like your formulation of this kind of feeling without being able to identify it or name it.
Yeah, name it.
I think that's maybe an interesting way of kind of thinking about it.
And I was thinking about, in the text, they talk about this idea of fluidity, the things that it's always a bit evolving. It's like, and also what you said, Franz, about the idea that it's an agency. Yeah, so all of this really talk about how this is really linked to the personal and the lived space. I don't know how we translate it, but l'espace vécu and all this kind of thing. Yeah, is really all related.
Yeah, or like seeing how it's maybe not just a, I think that's the approach of the more than human. I found that, I mean, again, it's not a really criticism, but it's kind of, I found it really fascinating. I think the sentence is really early in the text, like it's on 1124, so 1124, and it's kind of this like theoretical sentence where it says agency in this sense is not limited to intentionality and therefore mostly restricted to humans, and is instead conceived more broadly through the set of relations that co-constitute the world. And it's kind of standing there, and it's quite a big thing. And yeah, I was trying to like think through. It was like, okay, agency. It's like what for the rest of the article it was like, how can we think about that in terms of home? Maybe for me, I think it was again this kind of going back to control, you know, that it's not necessarily, I think Alet started with that earlier. It's like, you know, going away from the idea, maybe a problematic idea that we need to be able to control the home, that we are the master of it, the, you know, sovereign master of the home.
I think it's kind of saying that home is just a kind of an assemblage of different things, and that's kind of what, you know, that's a way to think of it, as lots of different things interacting with each other with their own agency, and not just about the human. Yeah. So it takes it into a different conceptual space, and that's why I like the article, I think, because it went there.
Yeah, that's true. You could say it kind of takes it, but takes it somewhere else. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we have more or less control at the home. It doesn't have to be total control. Sometimes it is. Some aspects are more controlled than others. It's just that it's a much more open concept than the idea that your home is something you totally rule, so to speak, which of course has all sorts of problematic implications with how, you know, homes are being treated in law, for example, not entering them in sort of crime situations because they're private space and all that sort of thing. So it challenges all that, really, a lot of this broader understanding of what the home is, really.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Miriam?
But I feel like for me, it's really like revolve around the concept of security. And when we look at the table at the end, like it kind of like all the non-human things that are listed are kind of in a way giving some kind of material security or like economic security, or like all these things seems to revolve around the concept of security. And I feel like control is really tied to that, like whatever way you define your security, like, or the danger, like maybe it's the invasion in your nation state, or it's not having status in a country, like insecurity in any of these ways, then you will have a need of control of your environment. So you will try to manage it. And so that's one point. I feel like security is really important in that sense. And you were talking about like, and it's all affects or feelings, like feeling secure or feeling at ease, like you were talking about going back to home, like first home. But I feel for me it's a feeling of easiness, like it's so easy just to be, because like you've been that way for so long, so it's just so easy to go back to that. And I feel like there is a really big class component to that, because if you're raised in contact with multiple contexts, then you can easily feel at ease in multiple contexts. So I feel like easiness, like in the way you act in the daily life, and security. And I feel like kind of a Maslow pyramid, you know, but like if you don't have security in the beginning, like the easiness can come in first place. Like I feel like you have to secure your place, and then after that you can build. And probably there is many other layers, but I feel like security, I mean, in the article was quite and in that sense, the other question I had was like, because they were talking about these non-human things, but it was all kind of a really, I felt, a restricted concept of nature, which is like animals, plants, natural, like the classic nature.
Yeah.
And I feel like like all the other things, object, like concrete, like buildings can be these non-human things, and maybe these are more threatening to people. Like it's less easy to get a sense of security, even more in cities where you have all these like installations that are there for keeping people away from public spaces, and even more if you're a migrant, you don't have status. So I think it would be interesting to see how these non-human relationships, all these affects in inner cities can create a total like different feeling for migrant people, and these relationships with non-human things can totally like just repulse people like away from inner city.
Yeah.
I think you're right that actually, you know, these are people just trying to survive, yeah, and that this is what they do to survive, and yeah, I agree. That's useful. Thanks, Miriam. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really brilliant contribution. I thought there's a concept of easiness. That is, it really like with me. I think on a conceptual and a personal level, I was like, you're quite onto something there. If you're at ease quickly through experiences of that, then something is non-threatening, and that this is deeply, deeply hierarchical within the West and beyond. So the jetting, academic from a middle-class family who has far easier time adapting to a kind of modern or whatever kind of fast-pacing environment, for example. But that was a really cool thing, and it can even be applied, I think, to the article. Maybe back to what Felix said about this idea of arriving. So it is quite interesting of this, like, yeah, maybe there's different phases as well of where homely or this kind of home goes from something that needs to be secure to something that maybe needs to be less about safety. So I don't know. So it would be interesting to be like, yeah, generally speaking, I could imagine the period of arriving is far more fractured and far more dangerous. It's an unknown space. It's the Unhomely, what Sergei brought in earlier from Heidegger, this kind of unhomeliness. So how that feeling of home and easiness, how this is also not stable. That kind of changes constantly. So even that is, a very open thing. But yeah, thank you. I thought it was a really cool, definitely a really cool concept. Very helpful, I think, to make sense of those questions. Yeah, Felix again.
I just had a question about the definition of non-human things. Like Miriam, you talk about like concrete and others objects, and I was thinking about those objects, but I wondering like where is the limit between non-human objects and, like, for me, like concrete, for example, or urban infrastructures like roads and stuff are human things, like they're constructed by human. So I don't really know the concept of non-human objects, but I was wondering, like, where is the limit of the non-human things and the human things, like because there in the article they talk mainly about like natural traditional objects, and I was wondering if it's possible to include other objects which are like human produced objects, but like still also like natural objects, not natural or like geographical objects.
There's a thing in there about material spaces, which I think responds to what you're saying. They're kind of like the things that humans, if you look at the table on page 139, so it's close to the end. So there's column 1 is non-humans, then imaginaries of homes, then it's aesthetic, homemaking and production of material spaces.
Yeah, material spaces.
That's kind of what you're saying, Felix. It's doing, yeah, the yard, the road. It's, yeah, but I think that they're kind of saying that those things which are obviously non-human are created by humans.
I think that's one of the problem of the article too, because like they kind of talk about the opposition between nature and culture, but they don't get to the bottom of it, which I don't think they could. They have space for that. But I mean, they don't even like just mention the problem about like classifying like some things as nature, some things as culture, and it's like depending where you stand and like philosophically, like it's gonna give you a total different like takes on the article, and that's why like me and Felix seems to disagree, because for me all these things that you say that is culture, like for me everything would be culture, like as a culture. But so I think, yeah, I think it would have been useful just to have a little, at least a note like on these really heavy like debates.
Yeah, we have the ghost of Neil Smith looking over our shoulders here about production of space, about how in many ways all things are many ways produced by capitalism and by people now. So the natural doesn't really completely exist as such. It does within, but it's so influenced by humanity. Anthropocene, of course, comes another direction of that. So it's sort of, it's blurring of all these categories. But I think probably in the article there they had to sort of stick with fairly traditional understandings of some of these things, but certainly I think we could extend it to the sort of more material realm, and how they're taken on board by the people more directly. But I think they have probably had enough to do in their article.
But do you know, because Keith, you seems to be like more maybe aware of these, like the literature on more than human, and I was even wondering if there was a difference between non-human and more than human, because the other article I read like revolving around that theme was about like homosexual spaces in London, I think, and they were talking about the toilet, like the space of the toilet as a meeting place, and the effect that there were between like the sink and the people. So it was really about like material, like object, like so for me it was really broader, but maybe you can let us know, or let me know, or let Felix know.
It's a bit, I don't think, I'm not sure talk about toilets in London too much, but I don't want to go there. It's a very tricky area, but yeah, I mean, I think the more than human here would usually be referring to what they covered here. Yeah, it wouldn't go into the sort of more material spaces. That would be, I mean, what term would be used for that? I don't know, actually. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's more than human because it's human, but it's also more than human because we build those toilets, but they have the significance, their meaning of them is out. We can't completely control it, so it's not completely down to people. But where it would fit in, I don't know, actually. Yeah, I mean, certainly this paper also cross-cuts with the whole sort of more than representational stuff as well. So how we can't, it's sort of like you were talking about sense of homeliness, which partly we can sort of, I think maybe I'll slightly disagreeing with Sergey there. You can sort of see it as an individual thing in terms of your own spaces, but it leaks out into something that's a bit bigger and broader for a community as much as for an individual. So homeliness is a sort of takes on a sort of life of its own that sort of can't be pinned down and represented that easily. And so it goes that, but I think a lot of it is very sort of personal and very individual, very representational, but it's that's another area really.
Well, I think that's actually, weirdly enough, a really nice open question. It's something we could definitely keep for the conference, I think. I like to, like, Milan, Mia, I think you guys know, we're kind of organizing. We hope that this will kind of, culminate the themes into the conference as well. I think I wrote that question down. It's like, so what makes the more than, so what do we include there, the more than human? Because sort of things that are human made and clearly constructed, not just physically, but also culturally, but like concrete material spaces, the roads and airports and things. How do we kind of conceptualize those regarding those questions? I think that's actually really interesting. So maybe something to kind of keep in mind there.
Yeah, because as part of all that is to what extent are the animals we come across are actually strongly influenced by humans in terms of how they've evolved, how they change, how they exist. Certainly in the city, for example, there's the feral, the semi-wild cats or something in the city are not particularly natural in terms of how they've evolved and developed, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we even still, how is it? Is it even, scientifically or like from a scholarly perspective, can that even still be done after, hundreds and hundreds of years of basically humans almost, having some sort of effect on pretty much any square square mile of this continent, like where is there space that's still really natural, so to speak. Yeah, definitely that's another really interesting conceptual question.
Smith 1984, I think.
Yeah. No, I just thought about it myself. I had this like experience from Scotland. It's sort of, if you drive through the Highlands, I mean, it's beautiful, beautiful natural beauty, but it's like, people kind of romanticize because it's empty. And I was like, no, there used to be people here. It was just really capitalism that either drove them out or south. And, it used to be all forest, and that got basically, like sort of, British imperialism needed chips. So there's a very, very distinct history that made this natural beauty. I always find that as a really fascinating example for myself as well. I was like, yeah, because I think people here know in the UK, but like when tourists, so I worked in tourism in Scotland for a while, when they come, they think it looked like, it's this untouched space by, that looks since thousands and thousands of years like this. And I was like, completely not. It's the utter opposite. So quite fascinating. Yeah. All right. Does anyone have any kind of last thoughts or something they really, really want to like spit out there as a last kind of thought about the paper? Yeah, Felix.
We didn't talk about the methodology, about like photo elicitation process, and I don't have specific things to say about this, but I found it really interesting. But like maybe it's because it's like a personal interest, because I'm doing this methodology too here in Bogota, but I wish I could read a bit more about this methodology and like the outcomes of it, and related to like doing research about migration population, migrants population. And
you mean photo elicitation, or
like for me there were like two methodology mobilized. The photo voice methodology, where you give a camera to people and then they will take photos, and then the second step of photo elicitation interviews.
Yes. Kind of combination.
It's like two steps of the methodology. But no, I found it really interesting also in the article, because we can immerse ourselves in the environment, and then we have more access to like visible data, visual data.
Absolutely, yeah. I thought that they mentioned it, but I don't think they applied it. Again, like they have 9,000 words, and there's just so much you can pack in. But yeah, I think Alad, you've done a little bit sorry, do people still have time, or like I don't want to keep anyone against their will in this reading group, but I think you've done a bit on this like walking as method. I think that there is kind of stuff about that, and I think that maybe Felix, if you're interested in that, there is quite a few. I mean, it's still definitely one of the less explored methods, but there is a small but expanding literature about that. Did you hear of that? Walking as method?
It's quite fashionable at the moment, really.
Yeah. So that sounds, from what you're interested in, that sounds maybe like something you should kind of read into, because that is really a way as well of being like relating to the environment and so on.
I think the good thing about walking is that if you go with somebody else, then they show you what they want to show, and also it means that interviews are less structured, and it also means that you can find things which you never thought you'd ask that question. The space, for me, you have three actors in the walking interview. There's you, the other person, and then the space itself. The space leads to conversations and leads to things, and that does come through in this article. I agree. I think the methodology in here is really good.
Yeah.
And like now I think about it, maybe I was a bit too positive about the whole article, and probably they got forced to make some like big conclusions at the end, which maybe wasn't the right thing. And but I guess the way that these three different imaginaries came through from this walking method and the photos was really nicely done and quite inspiring.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the walking as method approach, my my postgrad Natasha's used that quite a bit in her research, and just taking, she's looking at people, with gamekeepers, how they manage the land and the pheasant estates and things. And obviously you can sit them down and formally interview them. But of course, so much of their job is so practical, hands-on, and so you go with them to see what they do and ask them why they're doing what they do. I think she's getting so much more richer material from that than the more, especially for people not used to sort of formal academic type interviews. They're not used to big, formal interviewing. Lucky them. So it seems to be working very well for her. So yeah. But of course, there's all the practicalities of doing it, hearing the people, recording it clearly, and remembering to ask the right sort of questions, etc. But that's same with any method, isn't it? So, yeah.
But also, I think that when the researcher go with the people, like walking, it can also bring, like, you can produce others practices than where the people are alone, taking photos alone. So. Both methodologies have their benefits.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I kind of wondered that when I read the article, that again, like you have limitations of what you can do as a researcher. This is not a criticism at all, but I thought that's just a sense. I was like, this would have worked really well. This kind of walking element in there as well, because it is constantly, I think a lot is about the home, the porous home, how it goes beyond the confines of the home, the outside of the home. And I was like, kind of doing a bit of a kind of narrative of the interviews, and kind of how I think Alex is quite nice there. It's like it's you, the other person, and the space, and kind of including the space almost. Like, I mean, this has its own limitations, but yeah, it's just that I thought it kind of came to me, because I think they mentioned walking as method somewhere, but kind of more as an example of, and I was like, this would have really worked well with this example. But it's still, I thought the combination worked well as well. I think really, in the grand scheme of things, it's a very tight, nice article. It's a good scholarly piece, I thought, really, from top to bottom, sort of. Yeah, definitely, how I would say it clearly got peer. One of the reasons why I found it as well is that it has been cited a lot. So despite the kind of criticisms we had, it has it had like a couple of 100 citations already. Like, wow,
that's paper. That's very good. Yeah.
No,
I'm gonna look up these people. I think. Yeah.
It's not that such a kind of part of the reading group here. I mean, when we started, it was like that was always kind of my hope, is to read comparatively new stuff. So I think so far everything we've read is like from 220 latest. So the idea is to kind of, what has popped up very lately, and what, and this one, it had been cited a lot. So I was like, clearly people like it and see, like can relate to it and use it for their own work. And even you, Keith, you said, like, I'm gonna cite it potentially for the points it's making, maybe not about Bangladesh, but kind of about home and so on. So
yeah, sorry, it's Bangladesh, not India. Sorry, people of Bangladesh. Don't want to make that mistake.
Well, yeah. Brilliant. Thank you everyone for coming today. I thought again, I don't want to cut anyone off. Is there still something people are like really keen on kind of discussing? Great. No, thank you for coming. This was again like a super, I really like this little groups that gets me thinking about stuff. And really, we have those recordings and so on. I think it's really cool that we kind of have a lot of fruitful discussions here, and hopefully they will come in kind of, merge into the conference at the end. And like for us all as researchers and kind of postdocs, we have a kind of better sense of what's out there at, like in May, to say like, those are these different literatures. This is what we're doing. This is how it relates